Is that better?
Yeah.
Let me turn up the volume. Okay, is that better? I touched all the knobs. Either have to watch everything or it's a little loud. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for your patience, and we are very excited to get started. First of all, my name is Lisa Reinsberg. I'm the Executive Director of the International Justice Resource Center. And again, thank you for being here. Also, thank you to our panelists and to all of the co-sponsoring organizations, in particular the ACLU of California, for letting us use their space yet again for our Human Rights Happy Hour series, and to the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and to Megan Price for seeing this idea through over the course of, I think, 3 pregnancies between us. So to finally have this group together is very exciting. I wanted to start, before I turn it over to our experts, with just a little bit of context from the perspective of the work that my organization does, which is all about human rights protections, basically what our rights are under international human rights law and how we can go about enforcing those freedoms, those privileges. This, I think, is pretty obviously to anybody a human rights issue when you're talking about police brutality, discrimination, surveillance. We know, of course, the names of Oscar Grant, Alex Nieto, Eric Gardner. They are, though, just a few of the nearly 1,000 people who are killed by police in the United States every year. And their deaths and the surveillance that's related to protests around those deaths definitely raise a number of human rights concerns. The most sacred, the most fundamental is the right to life. It's interesting to look at that from the perspective of international human rights law, which dictates that the use of lethal force by a government agent is only acceptable when it is strictly unavoidable to protect a person from a violent attack, and when all other means of preventing that attack are insufficient. To break that down, that means that shooting somebody, putting them in a chokehold, can't be a means of preventing somebody from fleeing, evading arrest, or just trying to arrest them. It's meant to be the absolute last resort. And it can't be used as a preventative measure. It can't be used to stop an attack against somebody that hasn't yet started. If those conditions aren't met, then that is an extrajudicial execution in human rights terminology, which I think is a useful frame for looking at this. In these instances, of course, you'll often hear the officer saying that they believed that the person was about to draw a gun or was about to fire at them. Human rights law requires that that be an honest belief and that there be objectively good reasons to support that belief. So it's not enough to make that claim. It has to be reasonable, and it has to be honestly held. Stereotypes, racial discrimination, prejudices, those are not good reasons to believe that somebody is going to cause you or another person harm. It's also worth noting, I think, particularly in the US context, that, and especially in states that have, that allow, concealed carry, just the fact of possessing a weapon should not be an indication that somebody's about to engage in an imminent violent attack, right? Or what are we doing? Other human rights concerns raised by this topic include right to privacy, right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and just like in the right to life context, human rights law requires that restrictions or actions taken by the government to interfere with those rights be governed by law and that they be necessary and proportionate. So when you look at the history of kind of surveillance of activists in this country and the more recent trend of surveillance of Muslim Americans, a lot of those rights issues are raised. Governments also owe particular duties to human rights defenders or activists to ensure that they're able to carry out their work and not be harmed doing so. Finally, the overarching human rights concept that's at issue here of non-discrimination protects each of us from discrimination on the grounds of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, and other factors. So in the context of what human rights law would require, I think the reality in the US is all the more obscene. And our panelists will educate us on what that reality is and the work that each of them is undertaking to change it. So thank you again for joining us. Let me introduce our panel. At the far end is Malkia Cyril, the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Media Justice. Next to Malkia is Nicole Ozer, the technology and civil liberties policy director at the ACLU of California. Then Kristian Lum, who is the lead statistician at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And next to me, DeRay Mckesson, who wears many hats, but let's describe you as an activist and an educator. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience to ask some questions of their own. My first question is on this issue of killings by police. HRDAG, Kristian, your organization, has found that police are responsible for 1/3 of killings by strangers in the US. And let that sink in for a second. And that serial killers, mass shooters, and terrorists cause only 1/5 the number of deaths as police do. The Mapping Police Violence Project has found that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Kristian, DeRay, why is data collection on these issues so important, and what else can your efforts tell us?
Yeah, so I think one thing I should mention that is in order to make that finding that about 1/3, roughly 30% of people who are killed by strangers are killed by police, we actually had to use some relatively sophisticated statistical procedures. This is something, we at HRDAG have worked on for like the last 25 years to figure out how to do this in the setting of casualties. And the reason we had to do that is because the government database that's tasked with compiling statistics, compiling the complete enumeration of all the people who were killed, really only had about half of them in the database. And it's not just us who say that. There are a couple other studies, one that came out a couple of days ago that found that basically the same thing. The government database collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics that was supposed to be collecting all of the police killings really only had half. And then another study from yesterday showed that the CDC, their data collection methods also were really probably at best, these are at best numbers, recording about half of police killings. Honestly, I think this is pretty bad. It really should be relatively easy to know how many people are killed by police for a variety of reasons, which I think we can all go into. I think it's really important to know how many people are killed by police, and yet, even though we have these initiatives in place and these projects in place to collect that data, it really doesn't seem to be happening. And, frankly, I think it's kind of disturbing that the Guardian and the Washington Post, too, also have their own data collection efforts towards understanding how many people are killed by police, which themselves, do have their own problems. They're doing a much better job than our own government of collecting information on police killings in our own country. And so that's something that I find, really pretty shocking. But so, yeah, obviously we need more data, right? If the database that's supposed to be collecting information about police killings is really at best getting about half, that's a huge problem because we need to know how many people are killed by police and how that number is changing over time, right? We'd like to know, is it going up? Is it going down? Can we trust if there are more recorded in the next year than the previous year that it actually went up, or is it just that people started reporting now? We can't disentangle those effects unless they're actually getting all of them. And so if we had a complete enumeration of the police killings, we could do a lot of really great things, I think. We could, analyze which policies and procedures are associated with police departments that have fewer killings. Right now, it's a little bit difficult to do that without having a complete accounting of all the killings because, are you correlating some policy with fewer killings, or are you correlating it with fewer reported killings? Just there, this policy is associated with the police department that doesn't even submit data on this fact. So that's hugely problematic. similar to some of the studies I think Sam and DeRay have done in mapping police killings, we could even more fully understand the racial disparities in police killings if we had more and better data. We could single out especially violent departments for reform. And of course, it would be great if there were better mechanisms for reporting use of force so that we could hold departments accountable if certain officers had a lot of complaints ahead of time. I think this is something that the Invisible Institute is working on in Chicago. Even if it's not a good sample, even if it's not a representative sample. So say, for example, the officers who are the worst aren't reported because their victims are afraid, then at least we'll know who the police should have known about ahead of time, right? So it is massively important in this area. But, I'm actually a little bit of a contrarian, and this is something we do a lot at HR Deg. So I'm actually not going to extol the virtues of data, partially because this is what we do, but also because we're basically in Silicon Valley, and I think there's like Twitter and Salesforce like down the road. So if you want to hear about the unbridled power of data, I think they probably have a lot of things to tell you about that. And so I'd actually like to take a very quick moment to discuss some of the limitations of data and potential for data, data that's seemingly objective to encode bias. And I want to start with a quick example. There's two ways I think this can happen, but I'm going to start with one really quickly. So what would happen if we could compel police to record every single killing? Okay, well, sort of by design here, that would, we would know how many there were. And so our bottom line number would be correct. But if we wanted to make statements about the circumstances surrounding the killing, we'd have to actually demand a lot more from the data. We'd have to demand that the data is an objective representation of those circumstances surrounding the killing. And how would that happen? I think the most likely way that would happen is that after a killing, the police would submit some sort of narrative account of the events leading up to the killing. And I don't think anybody in here, I don't think this is a controversial statement to say that someone's narrative account of a very stressful and upsetting, I would hope, situation would not be an objective description of the situation, right? Not just the police, anybody who experiences that sort of thing, your narrative about the situation would be colored by your own biases and your own subjective experience. But that's probably what the data would start out by looking like. And then how we would make some sort of, we'd turn that into something we call data, right? Something that lives in a spreadsheet, even though narrative data is data, but something that actually looks like something we call data. You'd probably encode those narratives. So you'd probably have some column in a spreadsheet that said something like this person had gun or didn't have gun, right? Each row would be a killing, and there'd be a column of 1 if the narrative said the person had a gun, 0 otherwise. And I think the loss of context in this situation when something goes from these narrative reports where we can all agree that it's a subjective account of something where it's a series of zeros and ones and it's enumerated, it's numbers, and it's in a spreadsheet. We sort of lose the context, and it's easier for people to believe that the zeros and the ones are objective representations of reality. Yes, 1, the person had a gun. 0, they did not. Yes, 1, the person was violent. Yes, 1, the person was threatening the officer. And I think this is, I think a pernicious thing sometimes happens when this narratives, again, these forms of data get numericized. I'm not sure if that's even a real word, or coded into this data. And it's something you would never say is objective in the first place. Now that it's in a spreadsheet, it becomes objective. So say we had that column, had gun, right? What do we do? Then we'll sort of calculate something like 90% of the people had guns, right? And now that gets stated as though it's an objective statement of truth, when really all of that information is derived from subjective accounts of what was going on. And so while I think data is super important and we absolutely need more of it to understand what's going on, I think we need to think carefully about the limitations, think carefully about what the data can and can't tell us, and think very carefully about where the data is coming from and how it was created.
If you haven't read the report that talks about 1/3 of all the people killed by strangers killed by police, you should definitely check it out. It's an incredible report. I didn't know it was you.
Well, and Patrick, who's
amazing, great report. So you should check it out. We think about this a lot, and it is always shocking to me that if you were killed in America and a newspaper doesn't write about it, then you're not in the data set. So you just don't exist. So we would say that the number of people killed by police is woefully underreported, as Kristian already said. But if you're not in the newspaper, you're just not recorded, and that's why we think that some of the race data is off. So in some places in Texas, it looks like white people are being killed disproportionately more than people of color, and we think that people whose names are like John, James are being coded as white when they might be Latino, just because people are using sort of anecdotal data in newspaper reports, which is sort of wild. Also, Black people are more likely to be unarmed than white people, which is interesting when they're in police encounters, which is not what the public narrative sort of suggests. There's also no correlation between crime and police violence. So people will say just like a tough city. And because it's a tough city, the police have to do more work. And because like doing more work, they're more likely to be in situations where they might kill somebody or be brutal, be violent. And that's actually not the case either. We did the first, we created the first public databases of use of force policies and police union contracts. And some of the police union contracts are wild. Like they have clauses that say like the officer has to be disciplined in the least embarrassing way to the officer in the department. You're like, I don't even know what that means. What does that look like? Or there are a lot of places like Austin is a city where the officers actually get full access to every piece of the interrogation material before they have to write a complaint or before they can be interrogated. So any part of the investigation, they get access to it before they have to give a statement, which like no private citizen in any capacity ever gets. And with the use of force policies, like when we FOIA'd them, we FOIA'd the 100 largest cities. That's like our data set that we use the most. And like Houston redacted all of it. It was like deadly force can be used in, and then it was like all black. Like, that's not very helpful. And it was interesting because the reporters were actually so frustrated with them that a reporter got the unredacted copy and like leaked it to us, and then we put it on the website. But it's been interesting because we think about the importance of getting both the number data and then getting things like the police union contracts and the use of force policies, because we understand this as shifting the narrative so that we can shift the work. And people like hadn't understood the police union contracts as like a sign of change before, so they just like weren't working on it. Like they couldn't compare like their city to another city, so we did that comparison for them. And we've seen people all across the country, like they're activists in Austin now, who like use that first report that we did to go to their city council and say like, we should redo this, we should think about this differently. And we understand that systems and structures often change people's behaviors, but neighbors change people's minds. And so much of the data work helps us tell a story that is different so that people like start to think about what is possible differently. And I remember when the protests first began in August of 2014, people thought there was a crisis in Ferguson. They didn't think there was a crisis in America. And it took us a while to get people to like believe that there was like a crisis across the country. And I'm also mindful that we aren't born woke, because something wakes us up. And for some people, it was like a tweet with the fact, or it was like a Facebook post or an Instagram post. I remember the study, I didn't lose you, I'm so excited. I remember the study came out, I was like, everybody needs to see this, which is huge. And some of the other data pieces that we also think about when I meet with like mayors and city executives, like I'll be in places and like giving a talk about something else, and like the mayor's office will be like, can we meet off the record? Completely fine. And my question now for all of them, like police chiefs and mayors, is like, tell me how I can file a complaint against the police. Like walk me through the process, right? And you'd be shocked, like almost nobody knows, like they just don't know how to do it in their city. So I was in one mayor's office and he's like, you do it online. I'm like, tell me. And he's like, so he like Googles like how to file a complaint. I'm like, where does that go? And he's like, so the police like, what is the process, right? And like the reason that we asked that is because we were working with the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ a while ago when Benita was there, and somebody left their office. He was like, we would go in and do pattern and practice lawsuits, and we'd find that like it was impossible to file a complaint, right? Like you literally, like the way that the system was set up is like it would never actually go anywhere. And that's been an interesting way to like see how the systems and processes work is like another sort of data point when we go to cities and they give us lip service about like, oh, we really care. It's like, well, how do I complain against the police? Like one police in a major city, the police chief was literally like, when you file a complaint, people come visit your house and like get the information. And I was like, they do not. They do not. Like, tell me, this is the craziest. You do not have enough police officers to like visit everybody's house who files a complaint. That is crazy. But you'd be shocked at how, like the numerical data makes sense, and like we talk about that a lot, but some of this anecdotal, like the process data piece actually just goes like unexplored because people don't see that as like a site of contestation, and we think about all of these sites as being sites that we can contest.
Thank you both. There's going to be, I think, so much food for thought in this conversation, and my brain's going to struggle to keep up. But I'm glad that, as I think often happens with these human rights happy hours, see the connection being made between organizations and across work. And I love, DeRay, how you focus on these concrete places and topics on which there can be specific change using this data. That's what it all comes down to. So my next question for Nicole and Malkia, we know that when activists and ordinary citizens come out to protest killings by police or the impunity around those killings, they are often then met with maybe more police violence or with surveillance, including of their online habits. And your organizations work together to expose and to limit that kind of law enforcement surveillance of Black Lives Matter activists via social media, including here in Oakland and in Baltimore. What impact does this type of surveillance have on activism, and how can it be addressed?
So I'll just give people a little bit of background on sort of this data point. This was some work that we were able to do earlier this year that I think really is an important piece that sort of exposes some of the biased policing and discriminatory surveillance that we know is happening up and down the state and around the country. We got a tip actually from a community member in Fresno that they had heard that the city was using a surveillance system that was monitoring social media. And we submitted a public records act request to try and find out more about this. And what we found out was there was blatant racist policing that was happening in Fresno. The city was using a social media surveillance system produced by a company called Media Sonar that actually was characterizing hashtags like Black Lives Matter. Like, I kid you not, this was in the documents that we received, that if people used hashtags Black Lives Matter, if they used hashtag I'm unarmed, if they used hashtag police brutality, if they used hashtag it's time for change, that they should be seen as threats to public safety. Pretty shocking. I mean, to see this in the documents, I mean, we know it's happening, but to see it actually in the documents being given to police about how they should monitor people in their communities. So we exposed what was happening there, and community members were able to dismantle that system. But we started to realize, if it's happening in Fresno, where else is this happening? And we submitted Public Records Act requests to 63 agencies in California. And we found that 40% of them were using social media surveillance. This was all being done secretly. No one in the community knew about it. None had procedures for how it was going to be used. And one company called Geophidia was responsible disproportionately for a lot of the surveillance that was happening in California. And we found out being used by more than 1,000 agencies nationwide. And this company had specifically marketed its product to appeal to police bias. They had sold itself as a way to monitor overt threats, particularly unions and activist groups. This was in their marketing documents. A company representative had encouraged the San Jose Police Department to use its service to surveil the Ferguson situation. And it also boasted how it had been used to stay, quote, one step ahead of the rioters in Baltimore after the police killing of Freddie Gray. So we had gotten this information. We also found out how this company was getting this data. They actually had side door data deals with Facebook and Twitter and a bunch of other companies. And that's one called Malkia. And I was like, we found some crazy shit. So let's do something about it. And so we worked with Malkia and Color of Change, and we exposed it. And we pushed for the companies to shut down this surveillance side door. And we got Facebook and Twitter and the others to cut off Geophidia, Media Sonar, and a bunch of other companies. It cut off 1,000 agencies around the country. It also cut off all the federal fusion centers who had also been utilizing really sophisticated social media surveillance. This company, Dataminer, had access to the entire Twitter fire hose. They could do keyword searches through billions of real-time and historical tweets, location-based, and drilling down to monitor specific journalists, specific organizations, and specific activists. I'm not important enough, but DeRay probably was. So, and an example that this company used to promote itself was how it had been used to monitor student protests in South Africa. So this was what the federal fusion centers, the domestic spy centers, had access to all across the country. So we worked for a lot of months to try and get the companies to update their surveillance policies and to also enforce new anti-surveillance rules. And while I don't like to hear that people lose jobs, when I heard that Geophidia had gone out of business, I was damn happy. So that's some of the work that we've done on social media surveillance. And I think that, it's just one piece, it's just sort of one drop in the bucket, but I think that it did a lot to at least make some people who really hadn't seen what was happening be able to really see how social media surveillance was being used in really discriminatory and secret ways. And at least we've sort of turned down the knob a little bit on sort of what's possible in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I was very proud of that work. I thought it was important work. You know, to the question, you know, what is the impact and what can be done about it? I mean, I think number one, the impact is pretty clear, serious chilling effect, you know, on protests, but also, you know, that's a very vague way of saying people get real scared to come out. You know, they see what happens to you when you do. And some of that is, because I don't think it's limited to like online surveillance, right? Some of that is surveillance that happens on social media, and a lot of that is what's happening actually in the street. So let's just say that right now, between the kind of follow-up social media surveillance and then what's happening to folks directly on the street, people are scared. But let me say this. So one, you have this collusion between state, you know, between the state and kind of like private interests, right? So between Geophedia, you know, law enforcement agencies, and let's say Facebook. This kind of collusion, now Facebook said they didn't have any idea. They was like, we didn't know this was happening. How did you not know? But we knew. That don't make no sense. It's your company. You know what I mean? Like, I think you knew something was happening. I feel like you did. But you know, they said they didn't know, and they were very happy that Nikki told them. You know what I'm saying? Thank you, Nikki. No, we should have got a bonus for that. But you know, so we understand too that so the number one thing that happened in that case, for me, was the fact that social media platforms were put on notice. See, really, law enforcement, they would find another way, and I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. They always gonna have another way. But it's the social media companies, right? They're the ones who got to become aware that they're being watched, that they have a role to play, that their brand is going to be affected, that they have a choice to make, right? All of that. And so as part of like much broader concerns, you know, whether it's like fake news and Russia, and, you know, they have a lot of, Facebook got a lot of things to worry about right now, you know what I mean? And so, but the point is, when you put all that together, the platforms are being used, you know, to repress dissidents, largely Black dissidents, you know. So that's the first thing, like putting these social media companies on notice, making sure that there is a strategy to make sure that they are arbiters of human rights and not part of the repressive, you know, regime. That's one thing. The second piece here is you know, FOIA, right? Being able to use the power of FOIA to expose what's going on. Just today, we're also working with the ACLU. We submitted a FOIA request on all documents pertaining to the terms Black identity extremists and related terms like Black separatists, Black nationalists, and so on from the FBI. You know, what will that do? Not sure, right? I don't know. But one thing I know is that it will produce some very interesting data. I guarantee that we will find out something interesting there. So exposure, making sure that this stuff is not done in the dark. I think the other piece here is starving this beast. So whether we're talking about putting, you know, putting limits on some of these grants, these federal grants, that's how these you know, local police departments get these tools and get this equipment, right? So putting criteria on these grants that make it harder, whether it's local ordinances that make it harder, right? All of these rules that make it harder. We want to make it harder and harder and harder for local police departments to get this type of technology. And Geophedia is not the type of technology I'm talking about. I'm talking about the stingrays. I'm talking about the drones. I'm talking about, you know, all the police tech that you know, the little tools and toys, right, that these police departments are getting right now that are making surveillance easier, faster, and more secret. So we have to be able to limit that. You know, I think that City budgets is another strategy that we need to use. I mean, report after report has come out demonstrating like how large of a percentage of many city budgets the police budget is. It's a huge percentage of many city budgets, in particular cities that have a high Black population. Okay, so we need to shrink that, and we need to make sure that, for example, every tool they get, that's more money. So part of the strategy is to divest. We have to divest from this system. The last thing that I want to talk about is this thing about, we hear a lot about abolition. How many people have heard about abolition? Okay, so we need to talk about it because it's clear y'all for real, y'all ain't heard about abolition? Okay, let's talk about it then. So, many of us are out here making reforms, right? Various types of reforms to policing, but specifically, let's talk about police technology. Some of our local ordinances that we also support, around the country, and other kinds of policies which would, like I said, restrict and reduce the amount of surveillance that can happen, right? Whether it's about limiting what kind of tools and tech you can get or what you can do with them, right? Use policies and so on. But the fact is that it needs to be toward a vision of abolition, meaning that we need to be getting rid of policing as we know it. And I need to say that because when we say abolition, people are like, no, that's impossible. You have to have the police, but you know what? That's what they said during slavery. When abolitionists said, no, you have to get rid of slavery, people said, I can't imagine a world without it, right? So I just want to put out there that a vision for abolition, we have to be able to imagine a society that is not policed in this way, okay? Now, the strategy for abolition does require reforms, right? So we need to be clear about that, right? How do we get to an abolitionary vision, an abolitionist vision? We have to have some reforms. So what kind of reforms? I want to talk about, not just at the local level, but you may know that the, help me say this, Foreign Intelligence Service, FISA, what's the last word?
Foreign Intelligence
Surveillance Agent Act, thank you. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is up for renewal right now. And that act, there's huge loopholes in there that basically create a lot of harm for communities of color. And we don't know about it. People don't know about that act. So from federal law to local ordinances, there are some reforms that we can enact in order to further limit. So policy change is important. Additional oversight, the Open Privacy Commission is a unique and extraordinary thing. I think it may be the only one. Is it the only one? Right. We need more of those, right? Every city should have a privacy commission that oversees surveillance policy in the city. I mean, right now, none of that exists. None of that exists. What does exist is in the last year, over 22 Blue Lives Matter bills have been passed. What does exist is we have Jeff Sessions rolling back consent decrees, rolling back any police reforms that may have taken place over the last 10 to 20 years. That's what we have. So I just want to make sure that we are clear about the environment we're in, right? We're in an environment in which there are tremendous protections added, not the ones that already existed, but the ones that have been added in the past 2 years for police officers, okay? There are no mechanisms for accountability, and whatever did exist is being rolled back, not slowly, but surely, quickly, fast, right now. And at the same time, we have an aggressive FBI that is putting out new categories. So I just want to say this is feeling a little bit like maybe like 1968. You don't feel me? Anybody was alive in 1968? See, it's only like 4 of y'all. Come on. Y'all just scared to tell your age. What's up? You know what I'm saying? Like the point being that history is repeating itself. And the question is, where are we going to be? Are we going to be like the folks were then, with a fringe set of folks who were moving forward, with a radical analysis and a liberatory framework and a militant strategy? Or are we going to have a bigger us this time? A bit of us that is big enough, right, to win? So that's the question that we have to answer for ourselves. Are we going to be able to bridge that divide?
Thank you so much. Oh, we'll leave it there because thank you. DeRay, so kind of switching gears now, even though I'm still hung up on this, a bigger us, that resonates a lot. DeRay, you've demonstrated how social media, especially Twitter, can be used to inform people, rally them behind a cause. But what do activists, especially people of color, need to know about the pitfalls and the opportunities that come along with these platforms?
Thank you for your work on the surveillance. I was Zero Fox, which is the firm that the Baltimore police used, rated me a high threat actor during the protest. So I appreciate you getting rid of that company. Personally benefited from that. So I think about social media is helping us fight back against this idea of erasure and erasure optimism in two ways. One is that the story is never told, it's told by everybody but us. And in these moments, we became the underrated. We were able to tell our own story in real time. It was, you were in Missouri. What made the purchase in Baltimore sort of unique in the national landscape at the time is it was the first city that you ever saw aerial footage. Like you hadn't seen aerial footage before because in St. Louis, there was a no-fly zone on like day 2. So if it were not for Twitter or Vine at the time, like you would not have seen anything from our perspective. So that was huge for us. And I'm also mindful that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, right? And like I think that is a big part of how we think about Twitter for sure and the other platforms. And I'm always interested with the freedom of speech people that they don't ever think about protest as freedom. Like everything but protest is free speech, right? Like if you like shout at people, they're like, that's not free speech. And they're like, if you don't do it in the box, that's not, you're like, I want to be free when I have my free speech. Extra free. I think about this safety issue a lot. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for tweeting. Chuck Johnson tweeted this tweet that was like, please donate if you want to help take DeRay out. And like that was the tweet that got him banned. The FBI visited my house and I wasn't home and they left a business card that said like, DeRay, please call me when you get a chance. And my lawyer was like, do not call me. And my phone got hacked. I was on a panel just like this. We normally travel with 2 phones, one in my bag off and then one that I always have on. But this day on the panel, I had both of the phones like just sitting, like it wasn't my time to answer a question. I was just like playing the phone. And the phone, it's like, please activate your phone. And I'm like, that's really weird. I've never seen that before. If I turn it off, I'm like, something's wrong with my phone. And turn back on, it's like, no, please activate your phone. And I'm like, what? I don't even know what activate, I've never done that before. And I realized that somebody called, I found out later, somebody called Verizon. They changed my SIM card over the phone, which I didn't even know you can do. And then they reset all my passwords. So like the 2-factor went to a device that they controlled and they hacked into my Gmail and my Twitter account and they tweeted my endorsement of Donald Trump, which was a hard day. I was like, that wasn't me. But I had the other phone luckily, so I was able to like, reach people on Twitter and like get my account. It took the rest of the day to do. But I think about those things as like some of the risks of what it means to speak out, especially in a social media world. I'm not convinced that we are designed to take this feedback in such volume. And I had 800 followers in August of 2014. I have a little bit over 990,000 now. And the feedback is just so much sometimes. So it's like this balance of like, I believe in the platform, beautiful, but like the incoming sometimes is just like a lot to process. And what is beautiful about it is that it's allowed us to accelerate the pace of impact. So all of a sudden we can just like spread messages really quick. We can talk to people with very little interference in a way that we'd never be able to reach them. Like we have to go to their agent or their PR person. And I think about so many people, I think about Malkia is the people that I knew online before I knew them in person. And one of the things that we don't talk about enough that I'm deeply appreciative of about the protests in Ferguson at the beginning is that it allowed people who couldn't physically be present to also contribute. And so much of the organizing of the past, like meant that your body had to be in the room, like your body had to be there. And all of a sudden it was like, people could do a whole lot in the organizing space and like didn't physically have to be present, but could virtually assist us. Like the people who taught us what to do in the face of tear gas were people on Twitter. It wasn't like any national organization. It wasn't like we were on a phone call. It was the people on Twitter. And that was really powerful. And one of the most beautiful things about the protest is that there was like no organization that started the movement. There was no organization that sustained the movement. We thought that national organizations were going to come and like give us the answer. And like that didn't actually happen. But it was online that like helped us organize and build like an infrastructure that didn't require like one organization to be a lead. So like, I was a tweeter, there were live streamers, there was the bail fund. And like we all knew each other and we could all like spread messages pretty quickly, but we didn't need like one person to like anoint people or assign people. And that was really powerful. So I remember, you know, I would get calls being like, DeRay, we're doing a protest, can you come and like sort of cover it on Twitter? And like I could DM like a local news reporter and I didn't have permission to tell him what was happening, but I could say like, meet me at this corner, like at this time, and like you'll just be close enough for like when it happens, you'll be there, right? And we were able to figure out how to just maneuver in that space in a way that was just unlike the people before us just didn't have those tools, and we had them now, which is really powerful. I think that we've only begun to see the beginning of, we've only begun to see the power of social media. You think about like Vine was the only way that we had video. There was no Twitter video. You know, Jack, one of the reasons they bought Periscope was because of the protest. And I remember we were one of the first 30 users on Periscope. Like we tested it before Twitter bought it. And there's Twitter video. All those things like didn't even exist 3 years ago. So I keep thinking about what's going to exist in 3 years. And I'm even more hopeful that platforms will be places where people learn skills. Like right now, it's a lot of information sharing. People are really learning skills, I'd say. So I'm interested to see what social media does for like the skill building piece of it. Because the question I think for organizers in this moment is that the interest has far outpaced the organizing infrastructure to absorb it. Like it just doesn't, it's like not nowhere near comparable. There are way more people that want to do something good than there's an infrastructure for it. And like organizers generally are like call Congress and go to a protest. And it's like people have been to like 80 protests, 10,000 calls, and it's sort of like what else? And it's not that there's not what else, it's just that the infrastructure doesn't exist at scale yet to absorb that energy. And I'm excited to see that emerge.
Building on that a bit, Malkia, you touched on this earlier in talking about the fact that there's now more protection for police than in previous times. But you've been a part of or a witness to advocacy for most of your life, or all of your life, it seems. How does the climate today compare to previous eras for advocates, activists?
Well, I can only speak to the eras that I have seen. I can talk about, let me start here. My mom was in the Black Panther Party. My mom and my mother and father were both in the party. They met that way. My mother raised me. And I spent most of my childhood going to court, going for prison visits. There are hundreds of Black activists, Native American activists, Puerto Rican activists, locked in prisons today for crimes many of them did not do. I think, think about this, right? The FBI just put out a category called Black Identity Extremists. It builds off a previous category, Black Separatist Extremists, that was used to justify the opening of investigations against Black activists that had no other justification, meaning there was no evidence to support opening an investigation, nothing like that. What allowed for investigations to be started was this categorization, right? It provides the FBI with the ammunition to start an investigation. That's not correlated to any other related evidence. You can get warrants on that basis. You can, tap phones on that basis. There's a lot of things you can do once the FBI has categorized you as a threat to national security that you can't do without it, or that it becomes harder to do. Yeah. So, my mom used to tell me all the time about, how people would receive these letters from people they had known, saying all kinds of things, starting conflicts, beef. My mom had a hit put out on her life by a comrade, someone she knew and loved, because of a letter like this. And that comrade, who was in prison and was in prison for a very long time, only found out a very long time later when he got his Freedom of Information Act, when he got his papers, through the Freedom of Information Act, that this was a COINTELPRO operation. So my mom could have died because of movement conflict. So what I want to say is, first, in terms of how this era compares to previous eras, is that relationships and the quality of those relationships are the strongest form of security any movement has. So right now, if you are participating in any way in the degradation of relationship, you are a threat to movement security. That includes me. That includes all of us. So that's the first thing. And that's part of why I try anyway to not participate in that. I think the second thing is COINTELPRO was a dangerous domestic operation. And as you know, just like, technology doesn't die, you can't reverse you can't reverse technology. You also can't reverse a program like COINTELPRO. You can hide it. You can shut it down for a while. But once a program like that exists, it continues to exist. It can be defunded, it can be deactivated, but that doesn't mean it's gone. In fact, the impetus for it has always been there. It was there in the 30s, it was there in the 50s when it was initially initiated to spy on communists. It was there in the 60s when it spread its wings to focus on Black activists, and not even activists. In fact, under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, you didn't have to be an activist, you just had to be Black. So, this is very important here because we are talking about this is something that didn't stop in 1969 or 1971 when COINTELPRO papers were found. This is something that has continued. It's just been quiet, just like white nationalism, violent white nationalism that is surging in America right now is something that, again, it didn't go away. We're like, where did this come from? This is new. No, it's not. It is more visible and it is resurging because it has more space. So, where these, whether it's the FBI or it's vigilante violence, if it is fed, it will grow. That's the reality. I think the last thing that I'll say is, so the Black Panther Party was a decentralized organization. It did have, it had chapters, it had leadership, but it also had local leadership. The leadership was in conflict. There was a lot of, sound familiar. The point is that movements are similar to each other, no matter what decade you're in. Okay, they don't, there are certain dynamics. What's different today, one is I believe that movement leaders are learning from the past. I believe that to be true. I believe that organizations are necessary. I believe infrastructure is necessary. I think that organizers and activists are different and they are both necessary. They operate in different spheres, they do different things. We need to feed both. We need to make space for both. We need infrastructure that helps to centralize and create mass space for a mass base. And we need activists who can be more flexible, who can move beyond dollars, who can do things that organizers cannot do. We need all of that, just like we need artists who can say and do things neither activists nor organizers can do, right? Or say. So some of the stuff that we had in the 60s, and I say we, even though I was born in 1974, let's be clear, I wasn't there, okay? But my life has been shaped by this. My family's life. My family is the Black Panther Party. I'm a member of the Black Lives Matter Network. I'm a member of the larger movement for Black Lives. I am a part of this, right? That's for life. That's for life. And so I think that, I'll close with this. I'll just say this. Organizations help bring about accountability, but so does visibility, right? Those things can help bring about accountability. But there are two, visibility and power are different. They are different things. So I'm sitting here with you. You can see me, and I'll be on television, and I do different things like that, right? But the point is that means I have influence. That doesn't necessarily mean I have power. Power is a collective process. Power is something we have to do together, right? And we need infrastructure to make that happen. So what can we do? Well, one, let's bring back the serve the people part of the work, right? Not just the policy change part of the work, but let's bring back the serve the people piece that is a bit of a autonomous organization within communities that's very low, hyper local on some level, you know, and that really brings us into a space where we are using our resistance to the failure of our current government operations, using that resistance, using that anger about that failure to produce something that supports our communities. You know, resistance, protest is essential, it is central, but it's not the only thing. There's more. And so that's all I'm gonna say.
Thank you. I'm mindful that we are, I think, at the time mark when we would have concluded. I know we're barely scratching the surface on so many issues. I would like to continue if y'all are okay with that. But maybe we could continue as planned and just know that we're going over a little bit, if that's okay with everybody. Yeah.
I don't know, I thought it was going to 8:30.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're able to be here till 8:30. We've scheduled the panel for not the whole time, but glad to continue. So Nicole, we were going to jump back to this issue of surveillance and specifically the California context, where here the California Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or CalECPA, went into effect in January 2015 or 2016. Sorry, like I want to erase 2016. Yeah. Requires that all government entities, including law enforcement, obtain a warrant in order to search your cell phone or demand your electronic information from an online provider like Facebook, and also to provide you notice when they conduct that kind of search. Nicole, how far does this get us towards stopping secret and discriminatory surveillance?
Well, as DeRay said, you know, technology's been amazing in terms of being able to connect with people, but on the other side, there's so much data that's collected about who we are, where we go, who we talk to, who we connect with, and all that data is stored in these huge databases by the companies. And there's a federal law that's supposed to protect our information and stop the government from being able to obtain it. But that law, called ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, hasn't been updated since 1986. So it's a little outdated. I like to say, you know, Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers, and you know, cell phones were the size of bricks, and the World Wide Web didn't even exist. So, you know, there's a huge surveillance infrastructure. Law enforcement has taken advantage of just how much technology has advanced, how outdated the laws really are, and they have really engaged in sort of widespread surveillance shopping sprees in a lot of this data, and much of it has been very discriminatory. I mean, where is location data accessed from? It's, you know, low-income communities. Where are stingrays used to locate people? Baltimore, Oakland. And we have, for more than a decade, tried to update that federal law. And as you all know, hardly anything good has moved in Congress for a really long time. And the same has happened with surveillance laws. But we were able, here in California, we developed a really large coalition, including CMJ and a lot of other organizations, and we were able to update California law in a really important way to really have the strongest digital privacy law in the nation, and some say in the world. And what it does is it says that no government entity here in California can search cell phones or any digital device without a warrant. They can't use a stingray or anything else remotely to try and access your location information or anything else without a warrant. They can't demand information about who you've DM'd with or anything else, who you've texted with, who you've emailed with, without getting a warrant, which the federal law does not do. And if they have to give you notice that there has been a search, And if they break the law, this is actually one of the most important pieces. If they break the law, they can't use that evidence in any kind of proceeding or hearing. Here in California, in order to get what's called a suppression remedy in the law, you have to have a 2/3 majority of both houses in California, both the Assembly and the Senate. There's literally been maybe like less than a handful of laws in 30 years that have been able to do that, but we were able to get that for CalECBA, which is amazing in terms of at least rebalancing somewhat, because the technology has expanded so exponentially. So much more data is available now than in the 60s and the 70s. So you've got the same appetite for surveillance, but I'm going to steal Malkia, the supersizing of surveillance. There's so much more opportunity to get so much more data and so much more personal information and be able to track people, to chill their speech, to monitor them in just ways that were never possible in the 60s and 70s. And so, you know, CalECBA is an important step forward to at least have some protections in place, because there's a huge surveillance infrastructure. There's the electronic surveillance infrastructure, and there's also what we were talking about earlier, this physical surveillance infrastructure, where the federal government has been sending down more than $1 billion a year since 2001 to build surveillance systems on the local level, to buy stingrays, to have drones, facial recognition, license plate readers, video cameras, integrated systems together. And there's been little to no transparency, accountability, oversight. And Malkia mentioned, you know, trying to get DHS or the federal government to have requirements in place. This $1 billion a year is pretty much sent down, no strings attached. They don't have to tell the public about it. They don't have to have any safeguards in place. And we've been trying for more than a decade to try and get DHS to have some requirements in place. And because we haven't been able to get that done, now we're working from the bottom up. And so there's a surveillance campaign that we've been working on here in California for now 3+ years, and is now being done in a lot of other communities across the country to pass local ordinances. And Oakland is part of that. To have local ordinances in place that say you can't consider surveillance technology, you can't use surveillance technology, you can't borrow surveillance technology without a public debate, a cost benefit analysis, including the civil rights implications, and use policies and oversight. And that's just one way to at least try and get communities in a better position to push back against new systems in place. So the kinds of secret surveillance like we found out with social media, or when we find out a stingray has been obtained somewhere, that can't sort of exist in the darkness. At least community members can know and be in a position to push back. So to me, CalECBA is just part of a effort that we have been fighting at the ACLU and in coalition for more than a decade to try and, as Malkia said, you know, starve that surveillance infrastructure that has been quickly and powerfully being built for the last 15 years. So CalECBA was a huge victory. It was a Herculean effort. It required a very large group of us to make it happen, but it is possible. It is possible, but it requires a lot of energy, a lot of optimism, and a lot of just not taking no for an answer.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask 2 more questions. Maybe we'll condense a little bit and then take some questions from all of you. But Kristian, coming back to you, could you say just a word about your work around predictive policing?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it brief now that we're pushing the time here. Yeah, so predictive policing, I'm not sure if everyone here knows what that is, so I'll sort of briefly summarize. Essentially, it's applying machine learning or predictive models to police data to make predictions about who will be a criminal in the future, where crimes will take place in the future. And so earlier I talked a little bit about how data can encode bias by sort of encoding, subjective narratives, right? But there's another way that data can encode bias. That's by who is included in the data set, right? Or which sorts of things are included in the data set. This is what we call non-representativity. So data set would be non-representative. Say some crimes are more likely to be included in the police data set than others. So for example, if we were to talk about a data set on drug reports, drug incidents to police, for example, we know from public health data that people of all races use drugs at roughly the same rate. But if you were to look at police data on, say, arrests for drug use, you would find that people of color are much more likely to be arrested for drug-related crimes. And so that would be an unrepresented or non-representative data set if you were to use that to infer something about drug use or about drug crimes. And so if you were to apply machine learning models to that data set, what these models do is they learn patterns in the data that they're given. They don't have this sort of outside context to know that there's these differences in rates of arrest, and it should treat an arrest of a person of color differently perhaps than an arrest of a white person. It just learns the patterns in the data. And so one study that we did is we looked at what would happen if we applied predictive policing algorithms or predictive policing models to data from Oakland to predict where drug crimes would occur in the future. And I'm summarizing very quickly, but again, what we found was, one, the data in Oakland primarily had incidents of sort of police reports of drug use, including arrests or things reported to the police by outside people, primarily in West Oakland and I think it was along International Boulevard, so roughly in a primarily Black community and a primarily Hispanic community. And then when we ran the predictive policing algorithm on the historical police data, like would be done if they were using predictive policing in this context, it sent police back to the Black neighborhood day after day after day, pretty much every day. And it sent police back to the Hispanic neighborhood pretty much day after day after day. So the algorithm did what it was supposed to do. It learned patterns in the data and it reproduced those patterns in the data. And so the problem was with the data, right? The data was non-representative. It overrepresented the communities of color with respect to drug use relative to the white communities. The algorithm picked up on that pattern and then it made predictions to send police back to those locations over and over. And so I want to be clear here, this wasn't something that Oakland was actually doing. This was a demonstration of what would happen if they were applying a real predictive policing algorithm in this context. And so what I often hear is that, oh, well, predictive policing isn't used for drug crimes. Okay, sure. Some colleagues of mine did a FOIA request and found that a police department did say they were planning to use predictive policing software for drug crimes. So, okay, maybe they were confused about what they were going to use it for, perhaps. And there is a recent book called Weapons of Mass Destruction where they detailed how these similar algorithms were used to predict things that are similar to drug crimes, the type of crimes that the harder you look, the more you're going to find, right? So things like nuisance crimes, quality of life crimes, maybe public urination, I don't know, the harder you look, the more you can find. And so again, there's a lot of these uses of machine learning applied to criminal justice data that I think really reproduce and reinforce the inequities and the biases that are actually coded in the data to start with. And if you'll allow me like one more second, I think there are a lot of other places this is happening right now, not just in predictive policing where we did show that it would send people back, the police back to minority communities over and over, but it's also being used in risk assessments right now. So we have these models that are used to inform judicial decisions at pretty much every stage of the criminal justice process. Someone's arrested, they come in, there's a model, there's something that processes information about the person and makes a prediction that says, what's the likelihood that this person's going to be rearrested? What's the risk that this person's likely to be rearrested, right? They're using this fundamentally flawed data, this data on rearrest, where it can't disentangle that someone is likely to be arrested because they're likely to commit a crime, or that someone's likely to be arrested because they're being surveilled by police and they're subject to more police attention. It can't separate those two. And so if it's fed a data set where people of color are more likely to have been arrested, not because they're more criminal, but because they're under more surveillance, that will be reproduced in these risk scores that are then shown to a judge and said, they don't release this person prior to their trial because they're at risk of being arrested. Again, it can't disentangle these two effects. Are they at risk of being arrested because they're actually more likely to commit a crime? Again, sort of ignoring what is a crime, or are they more likely to be arrested because they're under surveillance? And so, again, I think thinking very carefully about where the data comes from, what sort of biases it encodes is absolutely of the utmost importance if we want to prevent the uses of data and machine learning and all the potential that machine learning has from perpetuating sort of systemic racism and problems in the past that these tools are meant to solve. Quick, there you go.
Okay, last question. For DeRay and Malkia. DeRay, on your podcast and in other platforms, you've done some work around cultural appropriation and related concepts. Malkia, of course, your organization is focused on a lot of issues around media representation, a whole host of other questions. You, on just one of the most recent examples, described those Facebook ads, those Russian-backed Facebook ads intended to scare white people with images of armed Black people as an attempt to subvert democracy for everyone by using anti-Black stereotypes. Can each of you talk a little bit about the role of stereotypes in media in this context?
I think that, so I think about it not only in the media, but in general in like the public discourse, which isn't always sort of dictated by the media. When I think about stereotypes, I think about either things that are like partially true but not wholly true, or things that rest on assumptions that go untended to. So I think about like smaller things like the language about equality versus equity, equality being this idea that everybody gets the same thing, equity like people getting what they need and deserve. And like in the public, we just don't like tease out the two in a way that makes sense. But like the work around justice is almost always equity work. Like the end of racism is equity work, the end of sexism is equity work. And it can get us to a place of equality, but parsing out the two is actually like an important part of the deal. And I think about things like what is the difference between jail and prison? Like a lot of people, like they're synonymous with each other, but jail is before you've been convicted, prison's afterwards. And you think about things like why are there not voting booths in every jail? Because if you're in jail, like you haven't been convicted, you haven't lost anything, right? Like you haven't been convicted of anything, but like aren't there voting booths? And people just like take for granted that like, oh, jail, like everybody just belongs in jail. Or things like what's a felon? You know, you ask people like what's a felon, and people literally are like, and this is part of the media, is that they're like the absolute worst criminal. Like every felon has killed like 10 people and blown up 3 buildings. That's like how people think about felons. And you think about in Virginia, theft over $200 is a felony. That is a pair of shoes, that's an iPhone, that's a bike. And in Virginia, you lose the right to vote permanently when you become a felon, right? So it's like people, their conception of what it is, or like in Chicago, it's $300 is much wilder than the truth. And like, how do we help people tease that out? And some of this is about like the simple truths, is like being really clear. I think that one of the hard things about the left is that because we're right about these issues, like people are just even worse at explaining it because like you're right? You know, obviously you know it's bad, and that doesn't resonate well. So I think for us, it's been a conversation about how do we make sure we have language that people can repeat at the dining room table. Like that is like always, I think about like how we use Twitter is like always trying to give people language that they can like repeat at the dining room table. So people get like $200 is like shoes, bikes, iPhone, right? Should you lose the right to vote permanently for that? No, that makes no sense. And like, how do we start to do that better in this space, I'd say? And I'd say some of the stereotypes in the organizing community is like helping people, I would say, think deeper about what the future of organizing could look like, what the future of authenticity looks like. So there are a lot of people who think about the authenticity of organizers and activists by their proximity to trauma. So whoever's been like the most traumatized, like the better organizer and activist, like that is what, in a lot of organizing communities, that is what people prime. So if you know 3 gang members and like, you know, grew up in a tough house and like you must just be better at organizing, quote, community, whatever that looks like. And that is a really dangerous way of thinking about this work. But like I think about authenticity as people's proximity to work. And that isn't always synonymous as people's proximity to trauma. Like those can often be 2 different things. Is that like both my parents were addicted to drugs, my father raised us, my mother left when I was 3, which doesn't necessarily make me a better organizer, doesn't necessarily make me know anything more about addiction, besides that I grew up in a house where that was like an issue. And I think that like we need to figure that out. And when we think about what does it mean to organize, is that I don't think that organizations have no role to play, but I think that one of the things that I lived through and saw, especially in the street in Ferguson, is that we stayed in the street for 400 days without a central organization guiding everything. And that was not something I would have ever imagined was possible, but like we did it. And I think that there is a way to sort of challenge and push on this idea of like what it needs to organize, because I know a lot of organizations that exist and like, I don't know who they're, like we talk about this language of accountability and I don't know what that actually means in practice for a lot of things, a lot of places. I know a lot of places that have a ton of money and like, I don't know what work is actually happening, right? I know a lot of places that have no money and I know a lot of work that's happening, right? So how do we start to tease this out and think about how we scale up in a different way? And how do we start to put public language to that? Because as much as I think things have changed, I think that in some ways the organizing activist community is doing what's happening in education right now, is that in education, people are talking about like technology is like changing classrooms. And the reality for any of you who do anything in classrooms, most of the classrooms with technology are doing the same exact thing they've been doing, but with smart boards, right? It's like the same teaching, but there's like a whiteboard now. And you're like, okay. Or like it's the same teaching with like little clickers. Like nothing, the teaching actually hasn't changed, but they're like using technology, whatever that means. And I think that in some ways, like there's some things that actually haven't changed in the organizing space, but people are just like adding new language. And I want to challenge us to think about like what it means to ramp it up and actually go to like a new style, given the tools that we have now.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. So to start with the first question around narrative and culture and stereotypes, you know, I do recall the 80s, right, where every newspaper was full of language about crack babies and welfare queens and, you know, so on and so forth, coupled with really aggressive drug policies, a war on drugs, war on crime in the 90s. Like, you know, so the first thing I'll say is that narrative power isn't just about beliefs, the beliefs of individuals. It's also about the structural relationship, the way that structures support meaning, right? So we're talking about think tanks, we're talking about schools, we're talking about religion and you know, religious institutions, all of these different things beyond just the media, you know, as well as the actual policies that structure our lives, create a mental map in our mind about what's true and what isn't true, right? What's real and what isn't real, how things are, how they're not, right? And so, so first off, when I think about media stereotypes and how they're feeding this current moment, I'm thinking about where is the power, right, behind the words? Where is the meaning being created? So, so for me, it's not just about the narratives that are in front of me, what I read, watch, and listen to. It's also about the power that's behind those narratives. So, you know, right now I'm working on the issue of net neutrality, right? Open internet. I'm trying to, you know, work with organizations across the country to ensure that the internet stays open. Why? Because of exactly what you said earlier, right? There is a need for us to communicate and build in real time, right? For us to be building movements on some level requires that level of alliance and interaction across geography. Open internet supports that. That is something that most people in this country are like, what is it? So what is it? So, you know, but the fact is that you want certain narratives in front of the public. You want to be able to move a message. You want, you know, Insecure, and you want, you know, the shows that move different ideas forward. Well, then you need a vehicle to do that. And that vehicle requires policy. So that's the first thing. My point is that it's not all about stories. It's also about the infrastructure that those stories need to pass through. And we have to defend it and we have to protect it. The second thing is this. You know, this country has been building a narrative of domestic terrorism for Black people and other people of color for centuries, right? That is part of the narrative of national security, right? Is who are we protecting against and what are we protecting? So in this country, there's some things that are being protected. There's some wealth that's being protected. There's some whiteness that's being protected. There's some stuff being protected on the inside. And there's some things that is being protected from. In order to support that narrative, you know, we have over-reporting of quote unquote Black on Black crime, right? You have over-reporting of Black people as criminals, under-reporting of white people as criminals, and that dynamic tells a lie, right? It just tells a lie about what kind of crime is happening, and then it supports this narrative, right? Why don't you ever talk about Black on Black crime? Now, the fact of the matter is, all over this country, Black people are organizing around crime in their neighborhoods. That's happening. It's happening every day. I don't know about you, but I've been to many peace marches, you know what I mean? Like, been to church, done it, you know what I'm saying? We're doing it. We're doing it all the time. That just doesn't, it's not even that it doesn't appear in coverage, although that's part of the problem, but also the impact that it has when it does appear is nil, because who controls the debate? What are the terms of debate right now? Those terms of debate don't leave any room for the narrative of Black agency and Black, you know, Black folks working together in their own communities, in our own communities, to do what we do around to deal with violence. That narrative and that story is not being heard, whether or not it's being told. Okay, so the point here is narrative requires power. It's not enough to speak on your own. It's not enough to be an individual speaking. It requires collective power. So whether that collective power comes through organizations or it comes through other means. I don't care, but the point is, it requires power. And let's talk about the power on the other side for a minute. We think about stereotypes, okay? We think about power in that way. We're talking about, countering violent extremism, a program that has been built over the last 10 to 15 years that has billions of dollars assigned to it, right? That is in schools all over this country, that is embedded in communities, in mosques, in churches, when you have programs like this, that have been built out of the war on drugs. So when they say we don't use this surveillance technology to deal with, or we don't use predictive policing to deal with drug crimes. But the thing is, you have a whole CVE program built on the war on drugs. So it don't really matter if you use this particular one technology on it. Your whole surveillance system is built on the war on drugs, right? So when you have that situation, you are also creating a narrative. Right? That the narrative is being created. I say all of this to say it's not just about the media. That's my point, right? It's not just about the news. It's not as simple as that. Narratives are being created through every act we take as a nation. It reinforces and undergirds a story about about Black people and about other people of color, about immigrants, so on and so forth. I'm going to end with this quote. My brother Muhammad used to always say for the Nation of Islam out here, disorganized truth can be easily overcome by a well-organized lie. Let me just say it again. Disorganized truth can be easily overcome by a well-organized lie. This is why I've given my life to organizing truth, because I'm tired of the well-organized lie. Right? Because we all live with the well-organized lie. Sometimes we believe the well-organized. We believe it. So in whatever way we can destroy some of these stories, know that we destroy them through organizing, through action, by building power, and not just by changing stories, by changing, what's said. What's said out the mouth is not as powerful as what's done with the hands.
Thank you so much for ending on that note, and I hope you'll join me with the round of applause for our guest.
Good.
So I know we're over time, and I thank you for your patience. Let's throw this mic out and see if we have any questions.
One down.
Thank you. We can pass this around, and yes, one question.
I appreciate the panel tonight and your experience. But my question is something that's happened. It was in the SF Weekly in September, and it's the launch of Vigilante under another name in San Francisco called Citizen, which allows for everyday citizens to tap into the surveillance or the scanners of police and then have live stream as to where these dangers are. I am not a tech person, so I'm just reading directly from SF Weekly. And I'm curious, how is that going to fold over into police surveillance?
I'm not going to speak to that specific that specific piece of technology. What I will say is that police surveillance is working right now, and police violence is working in tandem with vigilante violence. They're two faces of the same thing, right? So very often, what we'll find is that some of these vigilantes engaged in white nationalist violence, they actually work for the police department. Like that's what their day job is. So these are, this is two faces of one problem. And, when you add technology into the mix to aid, vigilante violence, I'll be very curious about the liability questions that are raised there. I don't know. But I think that's for our lawyers, you know. Thank you, lawyers, to figure that out. But in terms of organizing around it, I think, you know, that public exposure and suppression might do something there.
And I would say that San Francisco is one of the cities that has sort of very outdated surveillance laws. There's actually a law against a law in terms of transparency and accountability and oversight only for community safety cameras. And we've been pushing, like Oakland is moving forward with an ordinance, Berkeley is moving forward with an ordinance, Fresno has been working on it, Davis has been working on it. San Francisco hasn't really gotten its act together yet. So I would say if you live in this area, there's a lot of different ways to get involved. BART is also working on an ordinance. Mike in the front row has been doing amazing work for years on these issues. So I'd say there's a lot of ways to get involved locally on trying to make sure that the police just don't make decisions in terms of creating new surveillance infrastructure that the community doesn't know about, has no control over, no power to sort of push back against. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, and we're certainly trying to work locally and on the state level because that seems to be some of our best opportunities right now to really create some protection.
Vigilante.
Right.
I hate to cut this short. Apparently the microphone needs me. But
It's crazy.
I'm gonna stand away from that. So I hate to cut this short, but I'm mindful of how late it is getting. So if it's okay with our panelists, I would suggest that we stop with the formal panel now, and if you're able to stay, we can mingle and talk to one another face to face instead. So that those of you who have to get going can do so. Is that okay? Okay, great. Thank you again, Ben.
Like everyone else is gonna say that, like, I hear my